we have this study now. This was a new study. This was by Peter Abe, Dr. Christine Stabile-Ben, or co-authors. It's in the journal Cell, and it's titled Randomized Clinical Trials of COVID-19 Vaccines. Do adenovirus vector vaccines have beneficial nonspecific effects? But in this study, it says this, in the principal findings, in the randomized controlled trials with the longest possible blinded follow-up, mRNA vaccines had no effect on overall mortality despite protecting against some COVID-19 deaths. So you have two parts here. You have a vaccine now that we're finding didn't really show a change in overall mortality. So what's happening with the pandemic of the unvaccinated? Are unvaccinated people really dying, and the vaccinated people are really?
And to be clear, I just want to point out to people that maybe are new here, we have followed Peter Abe and Christina Stabile-Ben on this very issue. These are people that are pro-vaxxers that have been a really big part of vaccine programs for the third world or underserved countries. They started doing retrospective studies, especially of the DTP vaccine, and discovered that after 30 years looking back at the programs they did, they had kids that got the vaccine and did not get the DTP vaccine. And what they found was the children that got the vaccine ended up dying at 10 times the rate as those that never received it. It was a shocking discovery. And what they pointed out was every study up until that point was only looking at were the kids being protected from the diphtheria, tetanus, or pertussis. The vaccine seemed to block that from happening, but created other immune issues where they were dying of malaria and everything else, river blindness, all these things at higher rates. And so the mortality was 10 times the rate. So they've kind of been on this, investigation now, looking at a bunch of different vaccines because nobody is testing overall mortality. That's why it's interesting when they say, well, it looks like they blocked some COVID deaths, but the overall death rate amongst the group was no different in the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated. So the vaccine ended up somehow, whatever gains it made were reduced by the other problems that were killing people in that group. So it's interesting. Right. They keep finding this problem with the vaccine program.
Very key points there. And so now we go to the BMJ, and they looked at, there's a cohort study in the UK, a very large cohort study. And this brings things into a little more focus here. Risk prediction of COVID-19 related death and hospital admission in adults after COVID-19 vaccination, a national perspective cohort study. And it says in here, and try to follow me on this, it says results of 6,952,444 vaccinated patients in the duration cohort. Huge, absolutely. And it says 5,150,310, 74.1% had 2 vaccine doses. Of 2,031 COVID-19 deaths and 1,929 COVID-19 hospital admissions, 81 deaths, or 4%, and 71 hospital admissions, 3.7%, occurred, here we go, 14 days or more after the second vaccine dose. So follow me here. If you're not considered fully vaccinated for 14 days or more after your second vaccine dose, and they only found 4% of deaths in that group and 3.7% of hospital admissions in your group, that means 96% of deaths are in newly vaccinated, which they call unvaccinated.
Wow.
That's the deaths. And the hospitalizations, very similar. 96.3 are in this category.
Let's bring that up so people can look at it again, because we're doing some math here, and I think it's hard when you're not looking at it. So what we're saying here is they looked at the deaths inside of the vaccinated group, and what they found was 81 of them, only 4% of them took place after that 14 days after the second shot. All the rest, 96% of the deaths that took place, of the 2,031, all happened inside of what was considered still unvaccinated because the vaccine isn't considered to be working until after 14 days. All of the deaths were happening before. And here is where we see evidence and proof in a way that we haven't had yet of what we were saying. This group was considered unvaccinated. So these hospital deaths and all these things, they're being caused because your immune system is being suppressed. Now you're more vulnerable to the virus. You're dying from the virus or whatever else is going on, or even a reaction to the vaccine. All of that was lumped into the unvaccinated category. So they're telling you, pandemic of the unvaccinated. No, it was the pandemic of the newly vaccinated.
Right, and that's by their criteria, and it's what the study is not saying is what we're looking at here. It's not what they're saying. We're doing that kind of subtraction of those numbers that aren't being represented, but by their criteria, like you just said, 96% plus basically of those deaths and hospitalizations would have been in the unvaccinated category, leading to, 99% of these headlines saying 99% of the deaths are in unvaccinated. Well, It may be shedding a different light on that subject.
Absolutely. Wow. Brilliant reporting there, Jeffrey. And it's amazing to look back, at what we've been through. When we keep doing these stories, we've been assaulted with, tags of misinformation, and yet so clearly your investigations, the work that our international investigation team has been doing has kept us on point. And really helped us deliver such credible and powerful information. Thank you for being a part of this.
You are the unvaccinated. You are the problem. It is the unvaccinated who are the problem, period, end of story.
The only people that you can blame, this isn't shaming, this is the truth. Maybe they should be shamed, are the unvaccinated.
It's time to start blaming the unvaccinated folks, not the regular folks.
Anyone you came into contact with will blame you, as will the rest of us who have done the right thing by getting vaccinated.
Those vaccinated folks are going to start wearing masks to protect the unvaccinated folks. It's called a Christian value.
People are not behaving honorably. The unvaccinated are basically saying, well, it's open season for me. I can do whatever I want as well.
The unvaccinated are basically beating their breasts and running around the country saying, we don't care, we're living free.
The unvaccinated, a group that includes children and people acting like children. And the rest of us are starting to get off.
We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin.
The anti-vaxxers, they seem to have a thing for death and home remedies.
The anti-maskers turned anti-vaxxers are not just putting their own lives at risk. If that was the issue, we could just say that we can watch them compete to win place or show in the Darwin Award.
The vaccinated feel the unvaccinated are making me upset or angry.
This is not about freedom or personal choice.
Well, my freedom is being kind of disturbed here. No. Your freedom.
The other day, Howard Stern weighed in with a much different approach. Take a look.
When are we going to stop putting up with the idiots in this country and just say, it's mandatory to get vaccinated? Their freedom.
Dr. Fauci said that if hospitals get any more overcrowded, they're going to have to make some very tough choices about who gets an ICU bed. And that choice doesn't seem so tough to me. Vaccinated person having a heart attack, yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo, rest in peace, Wheezy.
Those who are not vaccinated will end up paying the price.
The unvaccinated should be taxed. They should pay more for health care.
We need to start looking at the choice to remain unvaccinated the same as we look at driving while intoxicated.
We have to start doing things for the greater good of society and not for idiots who think that they can do their own research.
Because frankly, we know that we can't trust the unvaccinated.
It's the unvaccinated who are the threat.
But you're treading on our freedom and you're making other people sick, and really you're killing other people.
You're basically punishing the vaccinated for the sins of the unvaccinated.
Oh, you can't shame them. You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
Don't get me started on the lunatics who won't take any of the COVID vaccines.
Literally, the only people dying are the unvaccinated. And for those of you spreading misinformation, shame on you.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
You are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individuals. I totally resent that. And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
So in your expert opinion, was the Wuhan Institute conducting gain-of-function research on coronaviruses? Thank you.
Dr. Redfield, did you agree, in your opinion, with Dr. Anderson's assessment at the time that this virus did look engineered?
It was very disconcerting to me. It looked like this virus was engineered.
In one sentence, can you provide a definition of gain-of-function research?
I think it's to take a pathogen and try to increase one of two things or both, to increase its transmissibility or its pathogenicity.
Has gain of function stopped a pandemic, in your opinion?
No, on the contrary, I think it probably caused the greatest pandemic our world has seen.
Misinformation. The greatest perpetrator of misinformation during the pandemic has been the United States government. Misinformation that COVID was spread through surface transmission, that vaccinated immunity was far greater than natural immunity, that masks were effective. Now we have the definitive Cochrane review. What do you do with that review? Cochrane is the most authoritative evidence body in all of medicine and has been for decades. Do you just ignore it, not talk about it? That myocarditis was more common after the infection than the vaccine. Not true. It's 4 to 28 times more common after the vaccine. That young people benefit from a booster. Misinformation. Our two top experts on vaccines quit the FDA in protest over this particular issue, pushing boosters in young, healthy people. The data was never there. That's why the CDC never disclosed hospitalization rates among boosted Americans under age 50. The vaccine mandates would increase vaccination rates. The George Mason University study shows it didn't. Over and over again, we've seen something that goes far beyond using your best judgment with the information at hand. We've seen something which is unforgivable, and that is the weaponization of medical research itself. The CDC putting out their own shoddy studies, like their own study on natural immunity, looking at one state for 2 months, when they had data for years on all 50 states. Why did they only report that one sliver of data? Why did they salami slice the giant database? Because it gave them the result they wanted. Same with masking study. Well, the data has now caught up in giant systematic reviews, and the public health officials were intellectually dishonest. They lied to the American people. Thank you. The CDC and the FDA and people at the NIH made up their mind before the trials were completed. They decided babies were going to get vaccines before the study was done, and when it came out, it found no statistically significant difference in efficacy between the two groups, and they just authorized it anyway. Why are we even doing trials? Why do we even have an FDA? Why not just have King Fauci decree that everyone's going to need this? And public health excluded anyone who had a different opinion. Ask any one of us that had different opinions than the establishment if we were invited ever to the Public Health Association or university forums. We had published collectively 400 articles on COVID, including peer review articles in JAMA, and yet we were excluded. So of course it looks like there's a consensus. But do you know that 40% of rural pediatricians in America do not recommend the COVID vaccine? How would you know that? That's a number that comes from a CDC discussion forum. We talk about vaccines as if it's all or nothing. You got to be all or nothing, like it's a religion. Does that mean does that mean all of you get the anthrax vaccine? Does it mean you get vaccines where the risk-benefit ratio isn't there? How about we just be honest? I'm not anti-vaccine in any group. I just like to see the data for boosters in young people or for babies to get it. Public health officials and the CDC are proposing that a 12-year-old little girl get 65 COVID vaccines in her average lifetime, in that average lifespan. Based on what? How about we see the data? Where did we forget the scientific process altogether?
Just how long can the UK government and other governments and mainstream media keep on ignoring the huge amount of excess deaths that is around? It's just quite incredible. I'm going to be looking at data today from Europe. This is from Euro Mono Bulletin, and as we'll see, this is official European data. I'm going to show you this site in a minute. This week, pooled Euro Mono all-cause mortality. Elevated levels of excess mortality. Overall, all around the place geographically and in all age groups. And we'll be looking at age groups such as 0 to 14. Now, the Chief Medical Officer in the UK has said that the excess deaths are caused by people not being able to get their statins during the pandemic. Well, most 14-year-olds don't take statins, so I think we need to do a bit better than that, to be quite honest. Average levels from pre-2020. Now, the thing about the data I'm about to show you is they take their averages from pre-2020, so we're not dealing with the increased levels in the pandemic. So let's look at another age group here, 0 to 14-year-olds. Now, I'll show you this on the cumulative data here, but it is increased for 0 to 14-year-olds as well. And again, if we see the baseline there, it actually is above. This will be clear when I show you a cumulative graph. But if we look now, we see a significant increase in this age group. These are young people. It's not lack of treating ongoing diseases which is causing this. I'm not saying that's not part of it in other age groups, but in this age group, I don't think it is. 15 to 44-year-old age group, again, seeing the baseline here and consistently above the baseline and sometimes above the significant level as well. We've got 1,371 excess deaths in 0 to 14-year-olds. These are huge amounts of deaths. So why have deaths in 0 to 14-year-olds in these European countries been higher than we would expect for all of 2022? So it's all over. Significant increase in excess deaths throughout 2022 and the first weeks of 2023. Also, of course, as we've just said, from the European data, it's all over and in all age groups.
So these rates are hundreds of times higher than previous estimates of myocarditis rates from these vaccines. But people argue that the myocarditis risk is worth it because overall the vaccines have saved so many lives. But what is the status of the evidence right now for this claim? Remember that there are other things that people die of besides COVID. Here's an interesting study showing that in the short term, from 3 to 12 months after suffering from serious COVID, the vaccinated have a modest 11 to 18% reduction in death rates. But after 12 months following illness, this is reversed, and the vaccinated have a 97 to 250% increased risk of death compared with the unvaccinated. Some people have seen this preprint circulating around. This is a Norwegian public health study purporting to show that vaccinated Norwegians had a modest reduction in all-cause mortality, so dying from any cause at all, not just from COVID, compared with unvaccinated Norwegians. So this study was saying, hey, the vaccinated, they're overall dying less than the unvaccinated over time. This study has not been peer-reviewed and is not likely to make it onto a peer-reviewed journal. And the reason is, well, I'll get to the reason in a second, but in fact, there is reason why we are not seeing a whole avalanche of such national database studies showing reduced all-cause mortality among the vaccinated. The reason is that when looking at national or other administrative databases, where the vaccinated group were counted when they showed up for vaccination. And I'll explain this a little bit more. And looking at unspecific outcomes, such as all-cause mortality, there's a very important bias at play called the healthy vaccinee bias. What is the healthy vaccinee bias? On the left here, we see in the group of people who are going to get vaccinated this week, among them, we're going to call him Mario. Mario realizes that he has a fever and a cough, so he decides not to get vaccinated this week, and therefore he gets counted in the unvaccinated group for this week. And the unvaccinated group, by the way, has a lot of these little orange guys that are sick. They've got the cold, they've got pneumonia, they've got some other infectious disease going on. That leaves the vaccinated group, once again, relatively clear of anyone who happens to feel sick at the time, because remember, Mario chose not to get vaccinated this week because he's sick. Then 1 to 2 weeks later, when Mario has recovered, he decides to get the vaccine and gets counted in the vaccinated group. Meanwhile, the unvaccinated group has many others this week who are like Mario was 2 weeks ago, sick. So the healthy vaccinee bias is caused by the fact that people who are sick at any given time with an acute illness do not generally show up to get vaccinated while they're sick. Meanwhile, a certain percentage of those who are sick and thus get counted in the unvaccinated group will die in the next few weeks from pneumonia or something else related to their acute illness. Therefore, this bias always works in favor of the vaccine, making the vaccine's efficacy look better. So much has been published in the past about the healthy vaccinee bias. I will look to a review article published prior to the pandemic in 2015, before the intense political wars surrounding COVID were in play. The authors conclude, after noting so much healthy vaccinee bias in the studies they reviewed, that cohort studies using administrative databases with unspecific outcomes, like all-cause mortality, should no longer be used to measure the effects of influenza vaccination. But the same type of bias works for COVID vaccines as well. Even with such a bias in play, we find some interesting things. This is a nationwide study from Hungary. They did try to account for the healthy vaccinee bias, but we find some interesting things when looking at their raw data. Now, the Hungarian National Database did generate studies showing reduced COVID-related mortality in the 2 months following a booster vaccine, modest reduced. It is likely that the healthy vaccinee bias is also responsible for some of this effect. However, as I said earlier, COVID is not the only thing that kills people. So what about all-cause mortality? The researchers claimed that as a whole, the vaccinated had better survival or reduced all-cause mortality in the immediate aftermath of getting vaccinated. But let's look at these survival curves. Okay, at the top, you see that the best survival curves, the lines that didn't dip down as much, were the non-mRNA vaccines, most of which were taken off the market, such as J&J, AstraZeneca, Sputnik, and Sinopharm. These curves were lifting the vaccinated group as a whole to look better. Also, let's look at the bottom performers, which happen to be Pfizer and Moderna, with more deaths and therefore a steeper decline in the survival curves. I placed a vertical blue arrow so that you can see the point in time when the researchers decided to analyze the data. That point in time was at 50 weeks, right before a major inflection downward in Moderna's survival curve, which is the yellow curve, which takes a steep downturn after that point. Hopefully you can see that one line, that one yellow line that's going nosediving, that is Moderna's survival. Pfizer's curve is also near the bottom in blue, and while this curve does not nosedive as steeply as Moderna's, it too takes a convex turn downward. The convex shape of these curves, rather than a straight downward line, means that the death rates are accelerating. In fact, the only concave-shaped curve, represented by the red line, which starts out looking bad, but which quickly curves upward, is the unvaccinated group, their survival. So by the end of data collection, at 80 weeks, where I placed a yellow vertical line, a yellow vertical arrow, showing it shows the much improved survival for the unvaccinated compared with Moderna recipients. And you can see from the shape of the Pfizer curve that it too is headed downward and about to cross under the unvaccinated curve. So what is happening here? What we are likely seeing is the impact of the healthy vaccinee bias initially, which makes the death rates for the vaccinated look better than the unvaccinated, because the vaccinated were a group that was relatively free acute disease at the time they got vaccinated. But over time, this effect wears off and we start to see what is really happening. I hope this gives you a few tools to understand better how to understand some of the claims that are thrown around. So in summary, studies comparing myocarditis rates in those who are acutely ill from COVID against myocarditis rates in the healthy vaccinated should not be used to make a risk statement regarding myocarditis rates in the unvaccinated population as a whole compared with the vaccinated population as a whole. The evidence as it stands right now puts a nail in the coffin to the erroneous claim that myocarditis is more likely if you are not vaccinated. This is especially true for young people. Also, the healthy vaccinee bias plagues studies looking at all-cause mortality where the vaccinated subjects are counted at the time they show up to be vaccinated. Currently, we have no good evidence that overall, for all-cause mortality, that the mRNA vaccines saved lives, especially in the long term. Lastly, I want to share that over the first few years of the pandemic, I treated many hundreds of patients with COVID using a combination of early and intense hydrotherapy, mostly fever baths instituted at the onset of fever, and ivermectin. When we were able to start hydrotherapy and ivermectin in the first 7 days of illness, I did not have a single patient end up hospitalized with COVID.
Dr. Song, that was highly enlightening. And I love all of you medical guys. You state things so cautiously. You know, we have no evidence that the vaccines decrease mortality, especially in the long term, but you just showed that we have decreased mortality in the long term. And that's me saying that. I don't want to speak for you, but you're a responsible researcher and teacher, and I appreciate everything you just shared with us.